Hello, I had a recent discussion with somebody on social media about, of all topics, murder, which has led me to have a bit of a sort of a muse and a ramble, which I thought might possibly be interesting to share with some people. Um, it started the social media chat because I was talking about a book I'm working on. I'm partway through writing a novel, which is a murder mystery set in the 18th century, and I've already written and published. I published one anthology of murder mystery stories set at various different points in history, and so that kind of discussion started from just general chat about the book to moving on to talk about the popularity of murder as a form of entertainment. Novels, TV shows, films, stage plays, radio plays. I mean, there's probably about 1 million different works of fiction out there, all based around the idea of murder. Plus, of course, there's things like murder mystery parties, which I love to take part in, where you all dress up as suspects and somebody or another is dead, and you've got to work out and follow the clues and try and work out who's done it and that kind of thing. So there's lots of different media of entertainment which takes murder as an entertaining idea, which of course is quite odd if you think about it, because if a real life murder were to happen to somebody you cared about, then it would be very, very far from entertaining. It would be quite the opposite of entertaining, quite horrific. It certainly wouldn't be seen as a fun thing, or it may well have a kind of an intellectual interest in that. If you're kind of thinking, I wonder who killed the man next door, that sort of thing, you might be intellectually stimulated by it, perhaps, especially if you've got any kind of professional involvement as a police officer or a barrister or something in that vein. But it's not pleasant in the real world to be involved, whether as a relative or a friend or a witness to a horrific event or anything like that. It's obviously quite horrendous. And so part of this kind of mulling over, inspired by this social media conversation, is thinking about, as many people have thought about in the past, there's no end of articles and things out there about it, why do we find, when I say we, I mean humanity in general, because it's not specifically people in one part of the world more so than people in some other part of the world. Every culture has its own versions of Agatha Christie. There are people writing in every language on earth, in every part of the world, writing murder mysteries, scripts for films and TV shows, and everyone everywhere essentially seems to be fascinated by the idea of murder, and so why should that be? There's fairly straightforward notions. A few kind of psychologists have written about this idea that it is essentially a form of establishing order in the face of chaos. So a dreadful death happens and people are under suspicion. One of them, well, possibly one or two, but usually a small number are guilty, and everybody else is innocent. And this is quite a fascinating idea. There's a short story by Agatha Christie which is called The Four Suspects, and I don't think I'm giving any spoilers away, because the story introduces these ideas in the first few paragraphs, so I'm certainly going to tell you who did it. But one of the themes of that short story is that there are 4 people suspected of murder. Only one of them's actually done it, but the other 3 people are being tainted by the shadow of guilt and suspicion, rather. People are looking at them and asking questions, thinking, well, can we trust this person or not? Are they a murderer? Are they this, that, the other? And the point of that story, which is a Miss Marple story, is that whilst you could certainly make a moral argument that murder is kind of coruscating to the soul of the person who does it, and they're being eaten alive by anxiety. Am I going to get caught today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year? There's all sorts of negative impacts on the guilty party. There's also very negative impacts on the innocent parties, who are quite unfairly living under the shadow of guilt. And so the process of the detective coming in and identifying the guilty party is not just about visiting justice on them and preventing them from committing future murders by getting them locked up in prison, or as in the case of most of Agatha Christie's early novels, they would have ended up on the gallows in most cases, preventing them from committing future murders by killing them, ironically. That's part of the justice process, the kind of introducing order to chaos, but it's also, which is the point that Christie's making in this short story, freeing the wrongly suspected, the wrongly accused, the people who are having to live with all of this anxiety. And of course, if you're in that, I imagine very few people actually are in this kind of situation in the real world, because real world murders are quite different from kind of work of fiction murders. But if you're in the situation where only a certain small number of people could possibly have committed this crime, and you're all under suspicion, you're kind of, not only are you suspecting each other, you think, oh, did my husband do this, did my wife do that, did my son, my daughter, so you're kind of looking at people who 5 minutes ago were friends and family whom you loved and liked. You're now looking at them as potential killers, but they're looking at you in exactly the same way. So it's this kind of poisonous, corrupting element of murder, and other crimes too, I'm sure. You'd be exactly the same if you were suspecting someone of being a sex offender or a bank robber or something. That potentially you'd have the same sort of eating away of trust, of friendship, of affection, of can I ask this person to babysit anymore, or are they going to do something horrific while I'm out of the room? So you've got all of that going on, and the idea, which again, psychologists, when they've been musing on the subject, the detective, whether it's Sherlock Holmes or Poirot or Miss Marple, whoever it is, they come in as an outside agent and they look at the clues and they go, oh, it was you. That process of bringing order, bringing explanation to something which is confusing, full of misdirection and red herrings and uncertainties and people lying through their back teeth, not only the murderer lying through their back teeth, but lots of other people trying to conceal the fact that they've had an affair, or they've stolen some money, or they've done something that's not the murder, but something that they want to keep hushed up, and therefore they're lying about things for reasons unconnected to the murder. So all of that confusion and uncertainty and mistrust and doubt by the final page of the story, or the final few minutes of the film or the TV show, is being resolved, is being put to rights. Now, obviously, in the real world, that murders are committed, which it can be decades before they're solved. Maybe they never are solved, like the Jack the Ripper case and the Zodiac killer case, where decades down the line people are still going, oh, was it him, was it her, was it this one, was it that one, mulling over possibilities. But obviously in fiction, almost all fiction, the whole point of the murder mystery novel or film or TV show or whatever it is that by the end of it, you, the reader, or you, the viewer, know what has happened. Some sense of explanation has been attained, some kind of justice has been achieved, things are put to right, and as various commentators have suggested, that's half the appeal of the fiction, is that in real life we're all faced with, well, not murders, that's quite rare, thankfully, but we're all faced with very difficult situations filled with mistrust and uncertainty and confusion and blaming the wrong people, or you getting unfairly blamed for something that's happened. And in reality, often that just goes on and it goes on and it goes on, and there never is a solution, there never is a kind of a resolution by the end of it. So we have an appetite for works of fiction that give us the kind of resolution, the kind of certainty, the kind of knowledge, the kind of fairness and justice. The baddie goes to prison and the innocent are redeemed from the shadow of guilt and suspicion. Things come to rightness in the world of fiction, primarily because they so very rarely come to rightness in the world of reality. There's a quote from Oscar Wilde, I had to write it down because I always get it wrong if I'm doing it from memory. The good ended happily and the bad unhappily. That is what fiction means. That's from the importance of being earnest. And it kind of emphasises, again, the appeal of fiction, in not just crime fiction, you could say the same of romance fiction or westerns or spy stories or whatever, is that they are giving you something that reality often doesn't give you, and that's why we eat it up in spades. Various studies have been done of book sales and film production, TV production, and crime as a genre eats up way more than any other genre, in terms of the number of books published, in terms of the number of films and TV shows made. It is just way more popular than any other type of genre, and has been for decades and decades, ever since anyone bothered starting keeping figures around book sales and figures around what TV shows get made in that kind of business. So this is a kind of a persistent worldwide pattern. It's not something confined to one particular culture, one particular decade of history. It's an ongoing fascination, and I think that's worth noting. But the other one of the other things that struck me in that social media conversation, which is something I think worth perhaps flagging up here, is that this might be considered in some respects a fairly modern interest. Now obviously, if we went back 1,000 years in history, the people weren't writing novels. There was no kind of mass literacy market. You did certainly have theatre and stuff like that, mummers' plays and such like going around, but we have very little kind of accurate recording of what was being staged and how many people went to watch this performance and how many people went to watch that performance. So some of this may be speculative, but I would suggest a key feature of murder mystery, particularly more so than a lot of other kind of crime, robbery and things like that, based fiction, is that murder mysteries, without necessarily being conscious of it on the part of the authors writing them, are reflective of what I think is essentially quite a Christian idea, and that is the importance of the individual soul, in that what has happened to that victim, whoever it is that's been bumped off in the story, is important. And it's not necessarily that they are socially important, although obviously you do get, especially if we're going back to the kinds of literature being published in the 1920s and 30s and so on, quite often it was stories about lords and ladies and dukes and earls and socially important people. But even when that kind of started filtering out to stories about the middle classes or stories about the working classes, and the victims of those stories were not rich, powerful, famous individuals, they were just Mrs. Miggins down the road or whatever, still there is an understanding that Mrs. Miggins matters. And if somebody has gone and bashed Mrs. Miggins on the head or shot her or stabbed her or poisoned her or whatever they've done to her, then that is wrong. Now that may sound like a blindingly obvious thing to say, but up until recently, and still I'd argue in many parts of the world today, it's not a blindingly obvious thing to say, because in many parts of the world and in many periods of history, Mrs. Miggins didn't matter a jot. No one would have given a flying donut about what happened to Mrs. Miggins. Maybe what happened to the king or the emperor or the queen or the high priestess or some other big important socially influential person, they might have mattered. But by and large, the majority of people did not matter. They didn't matter in the eyes of the law. They didn't matter in the eyes of many people. I'm sure if you were Fred the street sweeper at the lowest of the low and your wife got murdered, your wife mattered to you, obviously, and your personal grief and your personal tragedy, but you were probably also conscious, going back 500 years or whatever, that to the vast majority of other people around you, the death of your wife was irrelevant. Who cared? You wouldn't expect the local lord of the manor to rush out with his sort of armed guards to try and resolve the murder of your wife. You wouldn't be expecting a great deal of justice from the authorities, because you would be aware that in the eyes of the authorities, your wife and your own life and the lives of your children and the lives of your immediate neighbours and other people living in similarly impoverished circumstances, your lives were not important and not worth the effort of protecting. But a feature of Christianity, not early Christianity so much, I don't think, but certainly as it kind of gained momentum and gained social status, moved onwards, was an increasing recognition of the importance of the individual, that it was important to save a soul, and it didn't matter if that soul was of a rich person or a poor person or someone financially in the middle. Every soul counted. Very early Christianity was very much focused on converting the rich and powerful, kind of a top-down approach in society. But as the centuries rolled on, it became increasingly focused on everyone in society. The efforts to repeal slavery were very heavily influenced by a number of different Christian denominations and pushed. Now, before we go too far down that line, obviously for the first 1700 years worth of Christianity, none of the churches were particularly bothered about slavery. Slavery was going on. A lot of probably most actually of the people who owned slaves, at least in the Western world, were Christians. Obviously different if you go to the eastern parts of the world, it was Muslims and people of other religions that were owning slaves, but in the Western world it was mainly Christians owning slaves and not seeing a problem with that. So for a long period of time, Christianity was no more bothered about slavery than any other religion was. It was just, slavery was one of those things. It went on, tough luck, it happens. They weren't campaigning against it. But as we start to get into the kind of 16, 17, 1800s, then it becomes a thing to campaign against, and it's seen as a very wrong thing, a very bad thing, that slaves have souls, they're people, they're individuals, they shouldn't be treated like property, like cattle to be disposed of willy-nilly, that they have worth in the eyes of God. And that worth it's an egalitarian worth. So this kind of argument that in the eyes of God the soul of a beggar is as important as the soul of a king starts to take hold, which is quite contrary to the way the vast majority of people around the world, regardless of their religious background, have viewed humanity pretty much up until that point, where the soul of the king, the emperor, the big and important people, they were terribly important, but beggars and street sweepers and people who sowed seeds in the fields, they were just, so much meat walking around the earth, and if they died, they died. There was no great value placed upon them. And so what you've got with the murder mystery is a recognition of the value of everybody, so that the individual who has been murdered becomes important, and it becomes significant to establish that you can't just go around bumping people off who are annoying because you want their money, or because they looked at you a bit funny once, or whatever it is that they've done to slight you in some way, that it's now okay just to bump them off and continue on your merry way. The Sherlock Holmeses and the Miss Marples and the Poirots and the Inspector Morses and all the rest of them are coming in to say this individual who has been murdered should not have been murdered. Their life was important too. And that's even in the case where often the victim is not very pleasant. Sometimes some murder mysteries are based around somebody quite lovely being murdered, but an awful lot of murder mysteries, by the very nature of them, the person who has been murdered is, shall we say, a bit victim blaming, isn't it? But there we go. Has often given good reason to other people to want to murder them. They've been particularly horrible or selfish or greedy, or they've done some dreadful thing that people are out for revenge for. So they're often not terribly likeable people, and that's half the reason why they've been bumped off in the first place. So you've got a whole room full of people who hated the sight of them, who wanted to get rid of that person, or were greedy for their inheritances or whatever, and they bumped that person off. But even there, the detective comes in and says, yes, this person may have been a bit of an arse, but they were still important and they should have been allowed to live out their natural life. So they don't come in and say, well, they're a horrible person, who cares if they died? serves them right, that wouldn't be much of a murder mystery. They come in and say, yes, they were a nasty person, but they should not have been killed. So it's a recognition of valuing. And I think an element of that is still quite Christian, in that obviously Christianity is based very much on the notion of redemption. So that even that nasty, dreadful person who's done horrible, horrible things, they might, had they lived another few months, few years, or however long, they might have been redeemed. They might have got better. So the fact that the killer has come along, whacked them on the head with an axe, and ended it, they're held responsible in a sense that they have ended that person's life before they had a chance to be redeemed. And therefore, by implication in Christianity, maybe that person's gone to hell because they weren't redeemed and they were a sinful, wicked person. But they might have been redeemed if only they'd lived another few weeks, few months, few years. And so that is part of the valuing, I think, at any rate, within Christianity, that even vile people, their lives should not be ended unduly quickly, particularly when they don't have a chance to realise that they're dying. So the churches, the various churches broadly were, if not actively in favour of execution, they weren't, at least campaigning against execution until very, very recently, until in the 20th century, really. So, but there you've got the idea that the person in the condemned cell awaiting the hangman at dawn has been given a chance, even though they're going to die tomorrow. They know they're going to die tomorrow, so they've got the chance to reflect on their naughty ways and repent, and therefore go to heaven. Whereas someone who's killed very suddenly without warning, who's got no idea that they're going to die until it happens, they don't have that chance to repent. And that's part of the underlying ethos of why, even if Miss Marple, as she does in some of the novels, sits there and says, well, so-and-so did the murder and now they're going to hang and serve them damn well right. Because it's kind of a bit of a double standard in that you're saying you should not have committed murder, now go and be executed for committing murder. But from that church point of view, the person who knows they're going to die has a chance to think about their life and make informed spiritual decisions. The person who is whacked on the head with an axe without any warning hasn't been granted that chance to think about their actions and repent, and so they're being robbed of redemption, or at least the opportunity for redemption at any rate. So I think there's a strong element of that going on. So did people in ancient Rome, did storytellers tell stories of murders and kind of detective stories, and along came some ancient Roman equivalent to Hercule Poirot to solve the murders and put them right? They may well have done. That may well have been a concern, but I'm not wholly convinced that it would have been a sense of the value of every life, because you had cultures in which many lives, perhaps the vast majority of lives, were not especially valued in the eyes of society, or the eyes of the religious institutions of the day, which is of course something that as a pagan myself, it's maybe a shortcoming in the paganisms of the ancient world, that the things they did value are not the same as the things that we have come to value as a result of the kind of the aftermath of Christianization. That, I mean, possibly, if the religious cults of ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt and so on had continued unabated, possibly eventually after a good few centuries they too would have come to the conclusion that individual lives mattered, that slavery was wrong and everyone, rich or poor, had some kind of status in the eyes of the gods and therefore no one should be treated badly. They may have come to the same conclusions given time, but in that sense they weren't given time. They were dismantled and are only beginning to piece back together again in a haphazard sort of a fashion. Um, so would they have had the same concerns back then that we have now? I don't know. I don't know. It'd be nice to think that they did, but I suspect not. What was of importance, of course, was a sense of honour. That if somebody murdered one of your relatives, they had dishonoured your family, and it was important for your family to avenge their honour. And so it's not so much a case of the value of the individual life that's lost as the besmirching of the family honour. So I can imagine that if there were some ancient Greek version of a Sherlock Holmes character in the stories being told down the taverna, then that ancient Greek sleuth would have been less interested in the robbing of an individual's soul from the world and the injustice done to the individual than they would have been in the collective injustice done to this tribal group by some individual who bumped off a member of that tribal group and therefore offended the honour of that tribal group, and it was the collective honour that was important rather than the loss of the individual soul who'd been bashed on the head with a rock and done in. So there's perhaps still a concern for justice and a concern for revealing secrets that were hidden and so on, but maybe coming in terms of the motivation for why they wanted to do that it would have come from a somewhat different cultural standpoint than the kinds of things that we are concerned about these days. Oh yes, the other thing I was going to mull over, which I have witted about in other recordings in the past, is that this kind of growing sense of the individual that has come about in quite modern times is a recognition of personhood, and everyone, rich, poor, whatever, is a person. A person has legal rights, legal protections, they have value as an individual. That's something we don't, many cultures, many societies throughout history and still today do not recognise. It's a very modern take, a very modern idea to perceive personhood everywhere in all individuals. We've already mentioned slavery. Slaves were not seen as people in quite the same way. They were more like furniture, treated as if, in the similar way that if we've got a washing machine or a tumble dryer or something, there's a machine in the corner that does certain tasks, and hopefully they do them well, and if it breaks you just chuck it out and get another one. And that's pretty much how many cultures around the world have historically viewed slaves. There are these things in the corner that do certain tasks, and when they get ill or old or whatever, they're no longer functional. You throw them out and you get another one. There's no great sense of mourning or concern. People don't sit there and say to themselves, oh, I wonder if my washing machine is having a nice day today. I wonder if my dishwasher has particular hopes and fears and dreams of the future. You don't see them as people, they are machines. And in slave-owning cultures generally, that tends to be how they view slaves, is that they're just things. They're not people in the same way that the owners are people. And of course there is what these days would probably be labelled racism. I think in the ancient world that's a bit of a meaningless concept. People didn't understand race 2,000 years ago the way they think about race today. But certainly that tribe up the road, and it might only be 20 miles up the road, let alone 1,000 miles on the other side of the planet, maybe only 20 miles up the road, they were weird. They do things differently, they talk slightly differently, they dress slightly differently, they're a bit odd, them lot up the road. Often there is a sense that we are people. I'm a person, my tribe are people, but them lot 20 miles up the road, or 50 miles or 1,000 miles up the road, they're not really people, not in the same way. They don't have personhood, therefore they don't have the same status legally. Therefore, if they were to die or some horrible thing be done to them, does it matter? They're not fully people in the same way. Therefore, they wouldn't have been aggrieved about it. In a modern fictional context, we can read stories or watch films or whatever about murder mysteries taking place in other parts of the world to people who are not remotely like us in any way, and it's still engaging and it's still interesting if it's well written. We don't sit there thinking, well, that victim is not from my tribe, therefore I don't have to care that they've been murdered. We no longer think in that same way. But going back into the not all that distant past, and probably still in some parts of the world today, I think you'd find quite a lot of people who would think exactly that. They'd only be interested in what happens to those they recognise as people, which are essentially their own grouping, their own tribe. Everyone else around the rest of the world isn't fully a person, therefore you don't have to bother about them in quite the same way. So if they get abducted and taken into slavery, if they're suffering a plague or a famine, or they're victims of war, or they're being persecuted or murdered, well, what of it? It's not happening to my tribe, so I don't have to care. So that part of the sort of approach of modernity is an extension of what Peter Singer calls these circles of care, where we start to value a much wider number of people, including people we've never actually met. We know they exist in theory, but we've never met them. But they become included in our circles of concern and care. What happens to them starts to take on an importance and a significance. And by implication, there is an extension of responsibility that maybe I might give money to charity that's helping people who live 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 miles away because something awful has happened to them, and even though I've never met them and almost certainly never will meet them, I could help them in some way, and perhaps assume reciprocity that possibly people 1,000 miles away might be donating to charities that are helping me. So there becomes a much greater, wider network of concern and interest in both actual real people as well as in fiction people, in films and TV and novels and what have you, where we become enraptured in their story and we want to know who committed these murders. Will they be brought to justice? Will anyone else suffer by the end of the book or the end of the film? Is there going to be a second, a third, a fourth murder? What's going to happen? We become engaged in the lives of people who are not like us, which I think is a good thing. That part of being in the modern world is extending these circles of concern and recognising common humanity, or perhaps I should say common personhood, because obviously with animal charities and things like that, there is that kind of concern goes beyond the human to recognise value in the non-human as well. Not that I necessarily think we're going to get murder mysteries about who killed next door's cat. But, well, maybe we will, I don't know. But one of the elements I wanted to pick up on, I've gone off a little bit of a tangent there. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, going back a few hundred years now, he wasn't particularly bothered about next door's cat, or dog, or horse, or gerbil, or whatever. He was, however, concerned about animal cruelty, which may sound like a weird double standard or contradiction of what I've just said. His concern is that if Fred Bloggs goes and tortures next door's dog, Immanuel Kant isn't particularly bothered about the dog. What he's saying, or was saying, is that if Fred Bloggs is allowed to torture next door's dog with impunity, he will become a nastier and nastier and nastier person by engaging in this appetite for cruelty and sadism. And so the concern is not so much for the poor old dog as it is for Fred Bloggs himself and the fate of his soul. Again, that's quite a Christian point of view. Immanuel Kant was Christian. Therefore, something must be done to stop Fred Bloggs from doing horrible sadistic things, primarily because of the sort of person he will turn into. That not only will he perhaps corrupt his own soul, but of course he will start to become a danger to other people, other humans in the future. Because as numerous criminologists and police officers and whatnot around the world have noted, there are people who start often quite young, disturbingly young, tormenting animals, and eventually they get bored of that and they move on to tormenting humans. So if this kind of awful behaviour is something, Kant would argue, you can nip in the bud early on, you might prevent them getting to the point 5, 10, 20 years down the line where they're doing even nastier things to the next door neighbours, not just to the next door's dog. They're kind of, so you want to prevent that domino effect of the behaviour getting rippling out and becoming worse and worse and worse. So there is that kind of concern there, and I think maybe that is part and parcel of the whole kind of murder mystery fascination. Is that why do people kill? I mean, just about everybody has probably met at least one other person who is so awful, so annoying, so irritating that for a brief minute or so they entertained the fantasy of shoving them under a bus. But didn't do it. Obviously, if we all indulge those fantasies, there'd be nobody left alive in the world by now. And if you're unfortunate enough that the person who is so horrible and annoying and unpleasant is someone who is a significant part of your life that you can't very easily get away from, then that temptation to elbow them under a bus probably gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and requires more and more self-control to resist. All of the while, the individual who is driving you to distraction is perhaps quite oblivious of the fact that they're driving you to distraction, or if they are aware of it, they just don't care. Maybe they don't feel the likelihood of them getting shoved under a bus is particularly high, so they go on and on and on being an absolute arse without any concern or consideration for the potential risk to themselves of a backlash at some point in the future. Do domestic abusers, do they worry that one day the people they're abusing will turn around and clock them one? Some of them perhaps do. Others may envision themselves to be so fierce and ferocious and what have you that none of their victims would ever dare bite back. This is the risk, whether you are a domestic tyrant or you are a political tyrant lording it over an entire country and doing horrific things to your citizens and maybe the citizens of neighbouring countries if you invade them, that no matter how much power you have as various world leaders whose names do not need to be mentioned, find out that the more enemies you create, the more paranoia you have to live with that one day one of those enemies will shoot you or stick a knife in you or jab you with a polonium umbrella or whatever it may be that they do to get rid of you. And so the tyrannical, some of them at least, certainly do become very, very paranoid. And that is kind of part of this Kantian concern that if an individual gets away with wickedness today, tomorrow they might do a worse thing, and the day after something a bit worse still, and the day after that yet worse, worse and worse. So there is this kind of corrupting effect of unchecked wickedness, and that I'm sure there are people in prisons or walking the streets even who have committed one murder and will almost certainly never ever commit another one, because the situation around that one murder was exceptional. That they're not a budding serial killer who's going to have corpses under the floorboards all over the place. They were driven to an extreme circumstance, they snapped, they committed a murder, that's it, they'll never do it again. However, in fiction, the concern is that they will do it again, and a lot of Agatha Christie or Naomi Marsh or whoever else, or Nao Marsh, sorry, not Naomi, Nao Marsh, often a kind of a plot device is that the murderer doesn't stop at one victim. That by the time you get to chapter 10, there'll be a second victim and a third victim and a fourth victim. Where will it end? And that is, if not necessarily reflective of the real world prison population, it's a concern within fiction that evil itself is this corrupting force. It's a bit like a kind of a cancerous presence that eats away at somebody. They can't just do the one naughty thing and then never do another naughty thing ever again. That they'll end up committing more and more crimes. Often, well, at least in fiction, the second murder is to cover up the first murder because somebody has seen something or knows something. So it's not so much that they've developed this appetite for Jack the Ripper style slashings all over the place. It's more the sort of almost like a comedy of errors, that this problem leads to that problem, that leads to that problem, and they end up solving all of their problems by bumping people off left, right, and centre. So there is that concern about the corrupting impact, which is Kant's concern, the corrupting impact of bad deeds on the long-term spiritual development of the individual, that they'll gradually get worse and worse and worse. Which, although I'm talking fiction here, may well pan out in reality. That there are individuals, well, we know there are individuals who perhaps do one or two awful things, not necessarily murder. They could be stealing or forging checks or whatever they're getting up to. Start off doing some not very nice things, and then they progressively leads them to worse and worse activities if they're not checked, if they're not, there's no kind of consequence to hold them to account for what they have done. They progress on to do worse and worse things. So it's not, whilst it's chiefly a fictional device to keep the novel interesting or keep the film interesting by having more things happen and more things happen, to some extent there is a reflection of reality there, that for some people at least, one wicked deed very rarely stops at being one wicked deed. It leads to a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, etc. down the line, and it becomes this corrupting force. And perhaps the bedrock of this corruption is that other people do not matter. So you want a lot of money, Granny's rich, there's the inheritance. Granny goes down the staircase, you get the inheritance, you get the money because the money is more important than Granny. Somebody else's life is less important than whatever it is that you want. And you could argue that that sort of selfishness is the bedrock of an awful lot of misery in the real world, as well as in sort of works of fiction, of people who think, well, I'm going to do X, Y, Z to you, and you're going to suffer, but I don't care because I get what I want out of that. So my advantage is more important than your suffering. And that kind of has a rippling effect. So if we're thinking mini form of theodicy, why do bad things happen? Selfishness. Putting your own personal advantage and your own personal gain ahead of somebody else's pain. Somebody else, excuse me, somebody else's suffering is less important. Excuse me, that went down the wrong way. That obviously applies not just to the melodramatic things like murder in works of fiction, but you could say just general crappy behaviour, low-grade crappy behaviour, which we see 100 times a day, is motivated by people putting, well, often, maybe not every single time, but quite often by people putting themselves first, and the needs of others being less important, less relevant, or indeed totally irrelevant to others. But that's just a few sort of mulling ideas there. I did think briefly about talking in context of things like warfare and so on, that the legal definition of murder, that is to say a killing which is, not legally sanctioned, goes hand in glove with the notion that there are some killings which are legally sanctioned. So the act of taking a life per se is not at the root of a murder mystery. One soldier who kills another soldier on the battlefield is not going to be investigated by Sherlock Holmes. It's the soldier who kills the shopkeeper in the middle of a supermarket that gets investigated, rather than murder on the battlefield, or death, shall we say, on the battlefield. Because that death is not contextualised as murder. But even if it doesn't have a legal context in the same way, a question to consider, which is branching maybe a little bit outside the realm of wittering about fiction, but something to think about, does it have the same psychological, the same spiritual impact on the person who does it? So going back to this kind of Kantian argument, that not only is there the suffering of the person who's been murdered or whatever's been done to them, and of course the grief of relatives, loved ones, being shocked and horrified by what's been done, but the person committing the crime is damaging themselves, and they're becoming a worse and worse person, a more and more ruthless person, a more and more mercenary person who will do more dreadful things in the future, and this kind of wickedness becomes incremental. Does that apply to legal forms of killing as well? So, and I've never been on a battlefield, so I've got no experience to talk from. I've got no idea. But for somebody who has been on a battlefield, a soldier, a sailor, a RAF or whatever form of the military, if you shoot or kill in whatever method your first combatant as fresh to the battlefield, I would imagine that must be a pretty shocking thing to live with, to think, oh, I've actually shot someone, I've actually killed them. By the time you kill your second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth person, does it have the same impact? I've no idea. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Do you become kind of battle hardened after a certain time, a certain number of killings on the battlefield? Does it kind of depend on who, whether the person you've killed is another soldier or a civilian whom maybe you accidentally killed during warfare? Does it have a different impact on you? I would imagine from the testimonies I've heard being given at various historical events, it does, at least for some people, it has a significant different impact. And part of post-traumatic stress disorder from warfare is not only witnessing the death of your own fellow soldiers on your own side, but the kind of living with the horrors of knowing you've dropped a bomb on a village, or you've done this or you've done that, and it's resulted in however many deaths. Soldiers and sailors and so forth are obviously ordinary human beings, and even though they've been through training, it's a struggle to live with the knowledge of what they've done, just as it would be for someone who's not a soldier, not a serving military personnel. And it needn't be a conversation restricted only to military personnel. Towards the end of the academic year that's just finished, I had a request come in to create a conference, an event to take place next academic year around the subject of euthanasia, which big feature of that is going to be Canada and the Canadian MAID laws, as they're referred to, medical assistance in dying, MAID. Canada has, a couple of years ago, legalised euthanasia. There's all sorts of bits and pieces legally around it that's at once interesting and absolutely bloody horrific to look into, in terms of how that law started and where that law is going at present, because it's been around for several years and there have been adaptations and changes and proposed changes for the future. And I don't want to get bogged down in British politics because it's monumentally tedious, but our new Prime Minister, before I became Prime Minister, had spoken very favourably about the Canadian MAID laws. So one question in my mind, which is going to crop up within this conference when it's organised, is whether we're likely to face similar kind of legislation being introduced over here. Because a growing concern in Canada is that what started out as assisting the terminally ill in shuffling off their mortal coil a little bit earlier than they otherwise would do has got expanded to include wider numbers of types of people with different types of condition who can be offered the opportunity to leave the world early. And when I say offered, one of the big concerns is that it's gone from the patient having to be the one to say, I'm in constant agony, can you give me an injection to end it, towards increasingly doctors and other personnel initiating these conversations and saying to a patient, have you considered getting a lethal injection? And so it starts to be used almost as a kind of actively encouraged form of euthanasia, the way certain people in other periods of history decided that, we'll get rid of the disabled, or we'll get rid of mentally ill, or we'll get rid of this lot, that lot, some other lot, and bumping them off is is framed as being an act of kindness, when often it is an act of economics, that it costs a certain amount of money to keep people with medical problems alive, and if you just bump them off, it's cheaper. And so human life, we're back to this issue of the valuing of the individual. Human life acquires a price tag. Going back to Oscar Wilde, one of his other quotations about individuals who know the price of everything and the value of nothing is increasingly going to be, in some parts of the world, applied to human life. That the price of keeping this person alive in terms of medicines and surgeries and what have you becomes a factor that is of more significance than the worth of their life, the emotional, spiritual, whatever you want to call it, value of their life. But coming back to the point I'm rambling away from, if being a military personnel on a battlefield and you're shooting people and dropping bombs and doing whatever else, and as a certain number of individuals are dying, and you are then having to live with the knowledge that you've killed that person or bombed that entire village out of existence, or whatever it is that you've done, the same is already applying to doctors in Canada, and might apply to doctors in other parts of the world too, if things like euthanasia become legalised, and it's then the doctor, the medical personnel, providing the injection and bumping somebody off, and obviously being paid to do that. And the pharmaceutical companies who produce the substances used to give the lethal doses, they've got to be paid. So there's individuals who are professionally taking lives. They're not, in the legal sense, committing murder, because what they're doing is legally sanctioned. Therefore, it's not classified as murder. But does it have the same impact on them that Kant might argue illegal murders have on the individuals committing illegal murders? Does there become this kind of corrosive effect over time on the soul of the individual who is carrying out these socially sanctioned fatalities, or however you want to phrase it? I would think, I've never met anyone who's actually done any of that, but I would think it must have some effect. It must have an impact on you if you've been a participant to your 25th death. It's got to do something to you as well as towards the individuals who are getting the lethal injection. And of course there may be all sorts of other, as well as military personnel and doctors in euthanasia, utilising countries. Canada isn't the only country that has legalised euthanasia. There are perhaps other professions that I'm not talking about at the moment, which would also be in the situation where that somebody may be dying as a result of your actions, and you've got to factor in what does that do to you as well as what does it do to the victim and the victim's families and loved ones and so forth. There's going to be an impact there. Engels might talk of it as social murder, although he wasn't thinking of euthanasia. He was thinking of factory owners who didn't give a flying toss if half their staff died of chemical poisoning or whatever in the process of them making a massive profit, which again is another factor. If you've got rich doing something that's killed off no end of people, what effect does that have on you? I don't know. But that's loud. But we'll leave it there, and be interesting to hear people's points of view and opinions on this one.